Hello everyone, this is Preeti Sagar and welcome back to editorial discussion. So I have taken up all such important issues which had been published in the newspaper in the last week. So first article that is about the world is hardly wired for cyber resilience, defending civilian targets and infrastructure against rising cyber attacks will stretch the capability of governments. So basically this article is talking about basics of cyber security. It means cyber security or cyber threat or cyber attack. It has become a major global problem. We'll discuss in this article how many and where big countries or developed countries had been witnessed the cyber attacks in many different forms at many of the instances, and India is also one of that. So why these type of cyber attacks is increasing day by day? What all safeguards are needed? Okay, what safeguards are required? So context of this article is that a string of high-profile cyber attacks in recent months has been exposed vulnerabilities in the critical infrastructure of even advanced nations. It means advanced countries or developed countries, they have also witnessed, they are also being vulnerable to cyber attacks. So this has reinforced the need for improved defense against actual and potential cyber attacks by all countries across continents. So cyber attacks or safeguards from cyber attacks, these are required. This is the requirement of today's world. Okay, as it has mentioned that advanced economies or advanced countries, they have been targeted for these cyber attacks. They are vulnerable to it. So this kind of security should be provided so that all such countries should get safeguards from these kind of cyber attacks. So major cyber attacks had been seen in USA as well. So several high profile cyber attacks have been reported from USA during past several months, and by the end of 2020, instances of major cyber attacks headlined solar winds, and it was believed that it had been sponsored from Russia. It has rocked USA. It means USA had been attacked by one cyber attack which was named as solar winds, and it was suspiciously, it was said that it was sponsored from Russia. So that involved data breaches across several wings of US government that includes defense, energy, and state. Before US could even recover from this breach, thousands of US organizations had been hacked in early 2021, and in unusually aggressive cyber attacks by Chinese group that was Hafnium, which had been exploited serious flaws in Microsoft software, and it has gained remote control over affected systems. So basically in those cyber attacks, what they do, they basically harm or they basically target defense, energy, and state system so that they can get the access to the data, they can get the access to the details, the internal code details which are believed to be keep confidential. So one that was believed that Russia had done that, Russia had sponsored that. Other, it was said that in the beginning of 2021, one Chinese group, Hafnium, had sponsored this kind of cyber attack as well in USA. So in quick succession, USA had witnessed three more major attacks. That was an audacious ransomware attack by Russia or East Europe that was based on cyber criminals style dark side on Colonial Pipeline, which is the main supplier of oil to the US East Coast. That compelled the company to temporarily shut down operations. So because of cyber attack, which had been, that was suspiciously, it was said that it was sponsored by Russia or East Europe-based cyber criminals. So they basically attacked Colonial Pipeline, which is the main supplier to US East Coast, and it has compelled company to shut down its operations temporarily. So siege was lifted after Colonial Pipeline paid out several $1 million as ransom to unlock its computers and release its files. And there are some reports of the ransom being received in bitcoins, which was later seized by USA government. Another Russia-backed group, that was Nobelium, that had been launched a phishing attack on 3,000 email attacks that targeted USAID and several other organizations. Early this month, it means in this month, June, JBS that was US subsidiary of a Brazilian meat processing company, that was also been made target of a ransomware attack, and company had to pay a ransom in millions of rupees. So these attacks, these were basically all primarily on civil targets, and each one was of critical importance. Cyber, that is often referred to as fifth domain or dimension of warfare, is largely being employed against civilian targets, and that bring the war into our homes. And most nations have been concentrating till date mainly on erecting cyber defenses so that they can protect military and strategic targets. And that will now need to change. Obsession of military cyber planners that has been to erect defenses against software vulnerabilities that referred to as zero day, that had capability to cripple a system and could lie undetected for a long time. Most celebrated zero day software of this kind to date is Stuxnet. That is Stuxnet. That almost crippled Iran's uranium enrichment program few years back. And in today's time, other zero-day software that is no doubt exist, though little is known about them. And what is evident is that whole new market currently exists for zero-day software, which is outside the military domain, and the world must prepare for that finally. So by defending civilian targets and more so critical infrastructure against cyber attacks like ransomware and phishing, that includes spear phishing, apart from unknown zero-day software that is almost certain to stretch the capability and resources of governments across the globe. Somewhat in that manner, these nations have been forced to find the resources and methods to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic as well. One related problem is that the distinction between military and civilian targets is getting increased and it gets erased, and consequences of this could be indeterminate. For instance, the 2012 cyber attack on Aramco, that employing Shampoo virus, and it has wiped out memories of 30,000 computers of Saudi Aramco Oil Corporation. That has ever since been one of the reasons for very frosty relations between different countries in West Asia and Gulf region. So these are some of the instances of cyber attacks in the past. And cyber warfare is replete with several damaging methodologies. In civilian domain, two key manifestations of cat and mouse game of cyber warfare today. These are ransomware and phishing, which includes spear phishing. Ransomware attacks have skyrocketed, which demands with demands and payments going into multi-millions of dollars. Basically, in the ransomware, what they do, they attack cyber system, and for temporary period, that operation of so-and-so company in which cyber attack has been taking place. So for temporary period, it has to be shut down. To resume the working, to resume the function, what they need to do, company need to pay some amount, ransom amount. That is why it is named as ransomware. Okay, and after this, company is able to operate. Okay. So by this way, they are these ransomware attacks are being happening in the countries like USA and big, advanced countries, and in the return of it, ransom needs to be paid. Then only they can resume their operation. So ransomware attacks that have skyrocketed, it has increased with demands and payments going into multi-millions of dollars. It means ransom goes in multi-millions of dollars. So India figures prominently in this list, being one of the most affected country. Also, experts believe that of late, the recovery cost from the impact of a ransomware attack in India that might be tripled. And mid-sized companies in particular, today they face catastrophic situation if they are attacked and may even have to cease operations as well. So the need to be aware of the nature of the cyber threat to their businesses and take adequate precautionary measures, India has become extremely vital to it. Banking and financial services, these were most prone to ransomware attacks till date. But oil, electricity grids, and lately healthcare, these have begun to figure prominently these days. So what is especially worrisome at this time, when a pandemic is raging, that is the number of cyber attacks on healthcare systems. With data becoming a vital element in today's world, personal information has become vital commodity. One of the more vulnerable areas where data tends to be linked to a specific individual is in the healthcare centers. Why? Because many people are falling ill, many people are getting COVID-19 infection, so they have to hospitalize. Their details are keeping with the hospitals. So by attacking hospital computer system, what they do, they collect or they thief data from the hospitals. So compromised health information is proving to be a vital commodity for use of cyber criminals. All indications are that cyber criminals are increasingly targeting a nation's healthcare system, and they are trying to gain access to patients' data. To available data aggravates the risk not only to the individual but also to entire communities. And it would be a mistake to believe that we can hope for a respite from cyber attacks like ransomware and phishing. Cyber criminals, these are becoming more sophisticated, and these are now engaged in stealing sensitive data in targeted computers before launching a ransomware attack. That is resulting in a kind of double jeopardy for the targeted victim. And also, today's cyber criminals, especially those specializing in ransomware and similar attacks, these are different from the ordinary run-of-the-mill criminals. Many are known to practice reverse engineering and employ penetration testers to probe high secure networks. And the bad news is that the cyber landscape is poised to undergo more fundamental changes. So for this, motivation for cyber attacks vary. For some nation states, the motivation is geopolitical transformation. For cyber criminals, it is increased profits. For terror groups, the motivation remains much the same, but the risk factor may be lower. So it is insider threat basically because of this insider threats that is due to discontent with the management or for personal reasons that could well become an omnipotent reality. So basically these days the cybersecurity essentially it is hinges on data protection. So data protection is required basically. So as data becomes world's most precious commodity, and attacks on data and data system are bound to intensify in coming days as well. And as per the report, we create more than 3 quintillion bytes of data every day. Some put it at over 2.5 quintillion, with several billion devices interconnected to billions of endpoint devices which exchange petabytes of sensitive data on the network. And this is only bound to grow. That ensure data protection could prove to be a rather thankless task that complicates the lives of information and other security professionals. And data lifecycle can broadly be classified into data at rest when it is being created and stored, and data in motion when it is being transmitted across insecure and uncontrolled networks, and data in use when it is being consumed. So constant exposure lends itself to ever increasing data thefts and abuse. With mobile and cloud computing expanding rapidly, and also given the nature of the ongoing pandemic, cybersecurity professionals are now engaged in building a zero trust based environment. And that is why, what is the meaning of this? That zero trust on endpoint devices, and zero trust on identity, and zero trust on the network to protect all sensitive data. So what is of the interest is that there do exist quite a niche companies today which have developed or are developing newer technologies to create a zero trust based environment, employing software defined solutions for agile perimeter security, secure gateways, cloud access security, privileged access management, threat intelligence platforms, static and dynamic data masking, etc. So here the moot point is whether not only those in authority, but even more so those in the world of the business, especially oil and finance and specifically healthcare, these are aware of this, and more important, these are ready to utilize these technologies to ward off a cyber attack and safeguard their data. So for protection, there is a requirement of new technologies. So how we can do that? So by building deep technology in cyber is essential. And new technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and quantum computing, these are present or new opportunities, you can say. Nations that are adequately prepared for this, whether conceptually and technologically, and they have made rapid progress in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, and will have a clear advantage over states that lag behind in these fields. So pressure also needs to be put on officials in the public domain as also company boards to carry out regular vulnerability assessments and create necessary awareness of the growing cyber threat. In the end, it might be appropriate to quote IBM chairman that Arvind Krishna. He said that cybersecurity will be the pressing issue of this decade, and that value lies in the data, and people are going to come after that data. So in the whole context, we can say in the conclusion that data is the biggest thing. Data is a precious thing, rather you can say. It is very much important to save it as we save precious gems. Why? Because every game is played on the basis of data, so it becomes very it becomes very evitable for the country to secure these data, and for that data protection is required to provide safeguard from all such ransomware, all such cyber attacks. And especially during COVID-19 time period, earlier banking, oil, energy, these were the targets. But nowadays, healthcare has become the target for data theft. Okay, so that is all about this article. Moving on to the next one. Next is about planning for a biosecure future. COVID-19 has further highlighted the biosecurity concerns of synthetic biosecurity. Synthetic biology. So, context of this article, that COVID-19 has made it clear that traditional imagination of national security is no longer credible, and preparedness of nation states and tenuous global security arrangements that were insufficient in dealing with the crisis. Future of national security studies, therefore, it will be forced to undergo a paradigm shift if it must retain any policy impact at all, and it would need to rethink the sources of insecurity to begin with. In that situation, the growth of exponential technologies like synthetic biotechnology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, these are bound to change the theory and practice of national security. It means applied science can be used to provide national security. So COVID-19 has quickened the inevitable. Among the exponential technologies shaping the world today, the biological revolution is of exceptional importance. The rapid rise of synthetic biotechnology in the last 2 decades and its still to be understood implications haven't received sufficient attention from the security concerns or policy communities. COVID-19 has further highlighted the biosecurity concerns of synthetic biology. Argument is not that COVID-19 originated in a lab, but the dangerous bioweapons can come from labs. Basically, it has been blaming China that COVID-19 or coronavirus, that has been lab made. It is not natural, it has been lab made. So basically, if these kind of bio weapons, if countries are developing in the labs, and because of bio leak, this virus has infected so many countries. So why not we can provide solution in the labs too? Okay. So the new organism, that is biological parts and devices, can be created, or that existing natural life forms can be redesigned. It should ideally be the subject matter for scientists to concern themselves with, or for ethicists to debate. But in today's time, there is a growing realization that exponential technologies have hitherto unforeseen national and global security implications. For instance, in 2014, US Department of Defense categorized synthetic biology as one of the 6 disruptive basic research areas. And even though linkage between national security and synthetic biology is yet to become an agenda item in mainstream national security debates. So synthetic biology, that is a revolutionary technology. That is what? That is a revolutionary technology. And it can help us manipulating biological organism and processes for human betterment, and especially in treating diseases by re-engineering cell. Just a moment. Yeah. So with the use of synthetic biology, basically what can be done? It can be provide solution to big problems like health problems, like disease can be treated by re-engineering. It means by modifications in the cell. Okay, so basically this synthetic biology, what is that? It is a field of science which involves redesigning of organisms. And these organisms can be redesigned for the useful purpose by doing some, some modifications in the cells. Okay, so re-engineering of cells, by doing that, it can be it can be utilized. Okay, for useful purposes. So there may many risks which are associated with the technology, and it must be addressed before it become widely accessible. For one, there is possibility of deliberate misuse. While the technology is still not easily accessible, and the day is not far off when such technologies won't be difficult to access. So there is a need to carefully review, especially in the wake of pandemic, the biosecurity systems in place where such technologies are in use. Accidental leaks of experimental pathogens, these are another concern. Insufficiently trained staff, inadequately safeguarded facilities, and lack of proper protocols, that could all be behind such leaks. And the reality is that there has been very little focus on threats that emanate from biological sources. So, contrast to this, with the focus on nuclear weapons, facilities, and material, not only are they tightly controlled but are also the subject of strong global regimes. And this is despite the fact that a well orchestrated biological attack could have serious implications, and even though it would be less spectacular since its effects are less immediate. So, this was before synthetic biology came into play. And a well planned attack using highly infectious pathogens synthetically engineered in a lab could be disastrous. So, if we talk about bioweapons, so that may be a destructive weapon. So, what if such attacks are contemplated and carried out by state actors against adversaries? And how easy it would be to pin responsibility on a specific actor if the incubation period is high and the pathogen can be modified to hide its origin? So, unlike nuclear domain, the fields of biology or synthetic biology are not regulated internationally, despite growing military interest in synthetic biology applications and their potential misuse. The weapon of mass destruction capability of bioweapons and have been long recognized, but very little has been done by international community about that. And of the three types of weapon of mass destruction, nuclear weapons have received the maximum safety and security attention given the treaty and institutional arrangements associated with it. So chemical weapons comes next to it, and there is an international convention and an implementing body for this. When it came to comes to bioweapons, all we have is biological and toxin weapon convention. That is BTWC of 1972 with no implementing body. It means there is no implementation of it because there is no implementation body. So BTWC, that is Biology and Toxin Weapons Convention, these does not have a verification clause, nor does it have a clearly laid down rules and procedures to guide research in this field. The dilemma is evident in Article 1 of BTWC itself, which bans microbial or other biological agents or toxins, and whatever their origin or method of production is, there they have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. And in the other words, if we say, while bioweapons are banned, research for medical and biodefense purposes are allowed. So this is understandable. The problem is that there is a thin line between biodefense research and bioweapon research. Like biodefense research routinely uses pathogens and toxins for experimental purposes, processes, know-how, and outcomes of biodefense research. Could potentially be used to create bioweapons, especially with the new advancements in the synthetic biology. It means by doing some re-engineering of the cells. So biodefense, basically it is used for the research purpose, routine research by using pathogens, toxins for experimental purposes, process, and know-how. And biodefense, that is used for the creation of bioweapons with the new advancement in synthetic biology. So more so as the pharmaceutical industry has vehemently opposed any intrusive inspection regime. And ad hoc group set up in 1984 to negotiate a protocol to enhance the transparency of treaty relevant biological facilities and activities to help data violations of BTWC that submitted a report at 5th BTWC review conference in 2001 but was not being accepted by the member states. So initiative has been shelved, And since then, and pandemic have also highlighted that the traditional distinction at the international institutional level between biological weapons, that is a field governed by the VTWC, and diseases, that is a domain under WHO, that is World Health Organization. So it may not be useful anymore. And there needs to be more conversation between health specialists and bioweapons or defense specialists. So November 2021, BTWC review conference must take stock of the advances in the field, address the thinning line between biotechnology research and bioweapons research, and consider international measures for monitoring and verification. So India is at a uniquely disadvantaged position, which compared to be more developed countries in this area, that gives poor disease surveillance, insufficient coordination among various government departments, that deals with the biosecurity issue and pathetic state of the healthcare system. India has multiple institutions that deals with the biosafety and biosecurity threats, but there is no coordination among them. For instance, implementation of biosafety guidelines, that is the responsibility of Science and Technology Ministry and Environment Ministry. And the labs dealing with biological research are set up under the Indian Council of Medical Research and Indian Council of Agricultural Research. So these are under the Ministry of Health and Agriculture, respectively. So this highlights two issues that pertains directly to the biosecurity. One is the multiplicity of the bodies and ministers makes coordination difficult, and especially in the absence of an empowered coordinating body. Secondly, given the rising risk of diseases of zoonotic origin, the traditional ministry-wise separation might not be useful. So another important question is whether India, with its porous borders and ill-trained border control institutions, is prepared for defending against pathogens or dangerous biological organisms or agents that are arriving from abroad. And COVID-19 should serve as a wake-up call for them. So that is all about this article. Moving on to the next. So Biden's Manichaean vision that dividing the world into democratic and autocratic camp is unrealistic. So context is that G7 summit has taken place in Cornwall, UK, and it was noteworthy for the cohesive vibe among the member states. They have buttressed by their shared identity of being democracy. After 4 years of irrelevance wrought by the illiberal formers like US President Donald Trump, this club, he has said that this is the club of rich industrialized countries and has got a new lease of life under his liberal successor like Joe Biden, who believes that democracies should unite against authoritarian rivals. So as per Mr. Biden's Manichaean vision, that world is at an inflection point between those who argue that autocracy is the best way forward and those who understand that democracy is essential. By disproving the false narrative that dictatorships are faster and more efficient and refuting autocrats who claim that the age of democracy is over, these are driving forces of Mr. Biden's foreign policy. So at the Cornwall summit, his non-confrontational approach to his G7 counterparts that signaled democracies can manage their differences, they teamed up multilaterally and pushed back the influence and muscle flexing of China and Russia. So to make sure that the messaging about team building by democracies went across the host of Cornwall Summit. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who invited 4 other democracies as guest participants, and these were India, Australia, South Korea, and South Africa. So combination of G7 and first 3 of these invitees has drawn attention to an expanded D10 coalition of democracies, that is, coalition of democracies. So Mr. Biden's coordinator for the Indo-Pacific, that is Kurt Campbell, he promotes D10 as a necessary instrument to bridge European and regional, that is Asian, approaches to Chinese challenges. And since Japan is the only democracy for Asia within the G7, that forging a D10 with Australia, India, and South Korea, that could corral the USA's European and Indo-Pacific allies to present a transcontinental counterweight to China. A 78-year-old who built his career in American politics during the Cold War, Mr. Biden carries the liberal memories of that period when US mobilized allies across continents to beat back the Soviet Union. So with this, a new Cold War era has been started. So what is difference with today's new Cold War is that power is more diffused around the world, and economic interdependence transcends a neat division of world into black, that is dictatorship, and white, that is democracies. For example, despite being a USA ally and a democracy, South Korea is wary of joining a formal D10 or Quad Plus alliance that because its economy is interwoven with that of China. And India, which has been wooing the Europeans to bring their economic and military heft to the Indo-Pacific, it would be happy to see a combined transatlantic and Indo-Pacific formation like D10 that could counterbalance Chinese hegemony. But it cannot afford to alienate friendly undemocratic powers like Vietnam, Iran, or Russia, all of which are vectors for India's ambitions of becoming a leading power in the world. And for that matter, Americans and Europeans are themselves not diluted upholders of democracy. So USA's allies in West Asia that remain notoriously authoritarian, and European countries still cultivate client dictatorship in Africa. So talking about authoritarian partners. So as every democratic power has some authoritarian partners, that should be Biden-led pitch for a summit of democracies and contest with autocracies worldwide. It would be treated as hypocritical rhetoric. Politics is the art of the possible, and so is geopolitics. So G7 and D10, these are not idealistic alliances to spread democracy everywhere. They have to be selective in targeting adversaries and strike a balance among more values, geostrategic needs, and complexities of the present multipolar world order. To this extent, that cementing relationships with the principle of democracy helps corner specific undemocratic force, that is a practical utility of D10. But these concepts cannot uh, metastasize into rigid structures that waging holy war between good and evil. Navigating ambiguities with nuanced policies is the key. This is all about this article. Moving on to the next. The road from Galwan a year later. China is now in a different league, competing with USA. New Delhi faces the task of living with an uneasy calm. So, the Galwan Valley attack, it's been a year when China attacked India in Galwan Valley, where some soldiers had been died. So, so where China has reached in a year, what India is doing in a 1 year time or 1 year span of time, we'll talk about that. So context is that on June 15th last year, LOAC had witnessed its first death after 1975. So India after India-China war and in after 1975, basically 20 soldiers had been died in line of actual control area, and 4 soldiers of China's People's Liberation Army had died in the violent clash in Galwan in Ladakh. So an Indian news report mentioned that around 50 Indian soldiers had been taken captive by PLA during the clash, and they had been released in batches over 3 days. And although both the countries have given gallantry awards to the fallen soldiers, the details about the violent incidents have not been officially made public so far. So this is in keeping with the broader approach of the government, where no official briefing or press conference about the situation in Ladakh had been taken place in the last 13 months. And ministerial statements in parliament that was monologues with no questions allowed from other representatives of the people. So official excuse was operational security, but actual reason was to avoid political embarrassment. Government's political strategy for dealing with the Ladakh border crisis that had been based on the dodging, denial, and digression, and an honest appraisal of the situation in Ladakh that would be politically costly for a government led by a strong prime minister, as PLA soldiers remain in control of what was hitherto in Indian control. So despite the largely supportive news channels, government has not been able to convince the public about its version of events. In recent State of Nation poll, which has been conducted by C Voter, 44.8% respondents had said that Chinese encroachment in Ladakh was a failure of the Modi government, and only 37.3% said it wasn't. So crisis in Ladakh that erupted months after Mr. Modi had held second informal summit with the Chinese President Xi Jinping at Mamallapuram in Tamil Nadu, and weeks after he hosted the then US President Donald Trump for a political event in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. So, for some, attributing his foreign policy prowess to the power of his persona and his personal chemistry with other world leaders, and there could be no worse rebuttal of his claims that the timing of the Chinese incursions in the government identified solely with the prime minister and dominated by his office, there is no record of the cabinet committee on security that has been convened to discuss Ladakh border situation. So prime minister is being held responsible in public imagination for the setback. So current situation is not military precarious in Ladakh with a continued deployment of 50,000 to 60,000 soldiers in Indian Army that has been able to hold the line to prevent any further ingress by the PLA. Chinese presence on the Indian side of the LAC is Gogra, Hot Springs, and Dame Chowk. That gives PLA some tactical advantage, but the area which majorly jolts Indian military plans is the Chinese control of Depsang Plains. So, with official sources that tries to palm it off as a legacy issue, despite evidence to the contrary from many retired military officers, Indian Army has only weakened its negotiating position during the talks with the PLA. And in any case, there has been no progress in talks after the disengagement at Pangong Lake and Kailash Range in February. Outside of Ladakh, Indian Army remains in an alert mode all along the LAC to prevent any Chinese misadventure, but the bigger change has been its reorientation of certain forces from Pakistan border towards the China border. So the basis of this shift was articulated by the Chief of Defense Staff General Bipin Rawat when he recently said that China is a bigger security threat for India than Pakistan. And Ladakh crisis that has also exposed India's military weakness to tackle a collusive threat from China and Pakistan. To avoid such an eventuality, the government opened back-channel talks with Pakistan that has led to the reiteration of the ceasefire on the line of control. So Ladakh crisis that has also led the government to relook external partnership, particularly with the USA. And after this meeting with External Affairs Minister of India last month, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted that they discussed India-China border situation. An Indian side had been silent about it, but senior US military official had earlier spoken of intelligence and logistic support, which is to be provided to the Indian forces in Ladakh. And the Indian military that has sought to learn from the American experience of implementing multi-domain operation doctrine to wage a war of the future against a technological superior PLA. So China is a larger neighbor that has got a better force, better technology, and it was acknowledged by General Rawat recently to argue that India will obviously prepare for a larger neighbor. Military importance of Quad remains moot, with India reportedly refuting or refusing to do joint naval patrolling with the USA in South China Sea, and the two treaty allies of US, Japan, and Australia also refused. So, moreover, India's focus on its land borders and its limited resources of military modernization in a period of economic decline impine on its maritime ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region. So even as India has tried to talk tough with Beijing and shown greater interest in the Quad, and its attempts to counter the burgeoning Chinese influence in the neighborhood have faltered, and it has exacerbated by the mishandling of second wave of the novel coronavirus pandemic. So with the widening power gap between New Delhi and Beijing, the challenge is as much economic as it is geopolitical. Despite of this, the border crisis and the Indian restrictions on Chinese technology companies, China has displaced USA to be India's biggest trade partner in 2020-21, up to nearly 13% of India's total trade compared to 10.4% a year ago. And for the Modi government, it has been a difficult balancing act between its domestic rhetoric and external reality. So even though India has been dependent on China for medical equipment to fight the pandemic and asked for assured supplies, government has been reluctant to publicly acknowledge this dependence. And it has underplayed Mr. Xi's message to Mr. Modi that offering support and assistance. So it has been asked China to grant visas to Indian students and business persons, but it has refused medical aid or Chinese vaccines. Simultaneously, India has placed the border issue at the center of the relationship with China and arguing that there can be no normalcy without restoration of status quo ante at the borders. So for the past few years, decades, Indian planners has operated on the premise that their diplomats will be able to manage the Chinese problem without it developing into a full-blown military crisis. And that belief has been led to rest. Militarily, Chinese incursions in Ladakh that has shown that the idea of deterrence has failed. And a return to the status quo ante of April 2020 remains a mirage, with the Chinese side that is refusing to engage meaningfully after February. So India has learned that it can no longer have simultaneous competition and cooperation with Beijing, and dramatic engagement that started with Rajiv Gandhi's historic visit to China in 1988, that is over. So the bouquet of choices before Modi government is not appetizing. New reset in bilateral ties in the early 1990s is difficult because China is now in a different league. And competing with the USA, India will never be comfortable taking sides in a new Cold War between US and China, as it has always valued its strategic sovereignty. So China seems as keen as India to avoid a military conflict between each other, and though accidents like Galwan can never be ruled out. That leaves India with a daunting task of living with this tense and uneasy calm with China for some time, and a challenge brought to the fore by the Ladakh crisis. So the events of the past 1 year have significantly altered India's thinking towards China, and relationship is that at the crossroads now. So, choices made in New Delhi will have a significant impact on the future of global geopolitics. So, here in the end, what we can say that it's been a year between India and China clash, and few instances had already been seen. It's been 75 years when attack on or personal attacks had been seen at the India-China border or LAC area. So basically, the paradigm shift in the geopolitics, USA's bending towards India, that has hampered Chinese intention, and because of that, USA had offered help to India to provide logistics and operations in the border areas. India has denied to help USA in naval patrolling in South China Sea. Okay, because it do not want to make tension, it do not want to create tensions at the terrestrial border. So these are the things what we have talked about in this article. Now, next article, that is on G7. So this is an elite club. G7 needs to be more open and less exclusive in an increasingly interlinked world. So context is that the G7, that is at Paris base, sent out two very strong messages. The first was driven by the USA's new president, Joseph Biden, and his vow that America is back to take the lead on global challenges. And the G7 commitment to donate 1 billion coronavirus vaccines to poorer countries and to invest $12 trillion in their combined pandemic recovery plan depends on USA commitments for a larger part. And the special communique and on open societies for the G7 outreach and the invitation to fellow democracies like India, Australia, South Korea, and South Africa. These are also an extension of his started commitment to convening a democracy summit this year. So the slogan for G7, that was Build Back Better, that was a White House term to declare America's economy and jobs recovery plan. And the second message, that was the consensus among the 7 member countries on countering China. That is, the final G7 communique holds no less than 4 direct references to China, each are negative. That includes criticizing China for its rights that record in Xinjiang and democratic freedoms in Hong Kong, its non-market policies and practices, concerns over its actions in the China Sea, and a demand for a transparent investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 virus. Though the bonhomie among the G7 leaders were palpable, the differences and contradictions in the grouping remain a challenge. And even 2 decades ago, questions were raised about whether the grouping, like earlier it was G8, so whether the grouping could claim its mantle as the world's richest countries when emerging economies like China and India are not included into it. And on economic issues, European Union is a more representative unit than the individual European G7 member. Finally, the premise of a group like G7, that of an exclusive club of the haves or the best versus the rest, that seems anachronistic in a world that is much more interlinked now than in 1975 when the grouping first came about. So here what it is saying that the G7, it has become outdated because it has included only emerged economy. It should open its ways to include emerging economies like China and India. Why? Because when it was opened, when it was established, when it was formed in 1975, the world politics was at different level. Now things have changed, things are changing, things are growing and evolving. So in that situation, G7 should also change itself. So India, that was a special guest to the G7 or G8 rather, earlier it was till 2014. So since 2003, India being a special guest of this grouping, it has also maintained its independent course, especially on political issues. And it is significant that G7 outreach communiques that included the guest countries that did not make the same references to China as the main document, and Ministry of External Affairs officials clarified that Chinese aggression was not raised at the outreaches that focused on the pandemic, climate change, and democratic freedoms. So India has voiced concerns about some clauses in the joint communique on open social societies, which condemned rising authoritarianism, net shutdowns, manipulations of information, and rights violations. These are the areas where Modi government has often been criticized itself. And addressing the session on open societies, Prime Minister of India has said that India is a natural ally to the G7. And presently, government will be expected to walk the talk on its commitments at the G7 outreach, especially in the areas of information clampdowns, given that India had the largest number of internet shutdowns in 2020. So that was all about this article. Moving on to the next. Proposed global tax that may not benefit developing countries. So context is that recently G7 meeting has seen finance ministers of the seven nations communicating their commitments to a global minimum tax of at least 15%. It means all such companies who are working, for example, a Chinese company who's working in USA. So like these companies, these MNCs, 15% tax need to be charged, and that will be on the global basis. Okay. So this struck a chord with all those who wish that tax havens no longer prey at their tax base with exemptions and zero corporate tax rates. So there is more to this than meet the eye. So true agreement on the rate is just the beginning on a long road of to foregoing a political consensus on how these profits are being taxed, and more importantly, where these profits are being taxed. So for this, one must turn to the 250-page report of OECD on the Pillar 2 proposals. Glancing through the pages, it is clear that the complex proposal is designed to shore up taxes from low tax jurisdiction, especially on incomes from intangible assets. So it gives the jurisdictions of the ultimate parent entities of firms with revenue above 750 million euros and first right to tax the differential between the actual and the effective tax rate. A mirror rule that gives source countries like India the right to withhold a higher rate on cross-border payments to low tax jurisdictions that is subject to certain thresholds, and more so would require bilateral treaty renegotiations like rules applicable to residence countries. And G4 earlier had expressed their unhappiness with these thresholds, however they continue to design. So, minimum tax that has been hailed as an end to a race to the bottom, and essentially it is implying that even tax incentives that exist in treaty rates or local tax systems may no longer be available. So the jury is out on if tax incentives work in attracting investments, and there are some small countries that hang by the thread of limited means. Taxation remains the only alternative for them. And even for a country like India, the recent push to bring foreign investors through the International Financial Service Center is an incentive. And it is therefore unclear if the curtains are down on such regimes. So, exhibiting apprehensions, British Chancellor of Exchequer Rishi Sunak, he declared success and now seek to carve out London's financial market from the proposal. And therefore, concerns of loss of secure sovereignty to tax remain. So the Pillar 2 proposal that had been introduced along the Pillar 1 under OECD tax challenges that has arises out of digitization. And it is amply clear that Pillar 2 has moved beyond digital companies, and there remains an intricate connection between the two. So allocation of profits of big tech companies still remains to be decided under Pillar 1. And allocation of tax made under Pillar 1 to markets will be added to tax collected in the calculation of a minimum rate in a country. So any digital services like such as equalization levy will not count as tax paid for the calculation of the minimum rate. And Pillar 1 was criticized for the complex allocation of profits to market jurisdictions that is based on an arbitrary allocation between residual and routine profits, and that did not sit well with many developing countries. So many of them has adopted digital services taxes, triggering USTR investigations in 2020. Following a consensus, these investigations will result in an application of retaliatory tariffs. To arrive at a consensus, US suggests a revamp of Pillar 1, stating that the top 100 companies will be covered. So this needs to include not only tech companies, but G7 committed that 20% of the profit above 10% will be given to qualifying markets like India. So it remains to be seen whether all these changes will result in the desired reallocation of taxing rights to the markets. So the deal between 7 countries is being labeled a landmark, but in the absence of 132 other members of the inclusive frameworks, which includes India, that is co-opted on an equal footing by OECD, and it is not yet a global deal. History has been in the making for the past 7 years since the inception of base erosion and profit shifting program, where countries like India has shared the proposal to give countries their due share. And on the contrary, G7 meet evoked a sense of deja vu where rules for the world were being decided by the select developed countries. So the late arrival of the US is not just altruism, but an act of self-preservation. The tax cuts introduced by the USA during the past 4 years are to be reversed, and this cannot be done in isolation. All the countries, they must sign up for this proposal to work. If all do not agree to the global minimum tax proposal, it may spark a new sort of competition. Like corporations will search for countries without the minimum tax rule as their residence. To avoid chaos, countries are being offered the illusion of redistributive justice. So that was all about this article. Moving on to the next. Record FDI inflows? Yes. Pause for celebration? No. The inflows during 2020-21 that has not been in synchronization with the government's priorities for economic recovery. Reasons, we'll talk about that. Context is this: in an otherwise gloomy economic scenario, one area of cheer for the government has been the numbers of inflows of foreign direct investment. In the recent press release, Ministry of Commerce and Industries has announced that India has attracted highest ever total FDI inflow of $81.72 billion during the financial year of 2020-21, and it is 10% higher as compared to the last financial year 2019-20. So the credit for this record level of inflows has given to FDI policy regime, investment, and facilitation and ease of doing business. So two reasons have been given: FDI policy regime, policy reforms, investment facilitation, and ease of doing business. Because of that, 10% increase in inflow of cash or FDI in the form had been seen. So taken on their face value, these numbers are indeed creditable, especially given that global FDI inflows in 2020 that has declined by 42%, and over the level in 2019 and inflows to developing countries had fallen by 12%. So, if we consider the disaggregated data on inflows into India, the reality of foreign investors' participation in the Indian economy, that seems a sharp contrast to what the ministry has presented. And RBI provides a useful disaggregation of total inflows of foreign capital into India. This shows that net of repatriation or disinvestment, FDI inflows had declined by 2.4% in 2020-21, and it is as compared to the previous year. So this is due to a 47.2% increase in repatriation or disinvestment, which had reached a record level of $27.0 billion. RBI reports another disquieting aspect of foreign capital inflow in 2020-21, that is a high increase in portfolio investment that has fueled entirely a 69-fold increase in the participation by foreign institutional investors that has totaled $38 billion. This was the second highest level of FII's involvement in India after they invested $42 billion in 2014-15. Surely sustained sizable repatriation of long-term FDI together with a large increase in speculative capital does not bode well for an economy that looking for recovery from an economic slump. So analysis of FDI inflows that remains largely incomplete without referring to the largest recipients of FDI, which is possible using the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade database. Currently, data for the first 3 quarters of 2020-21, these are available, during which 86% of the equity inflows for the financial year was received. And the data shows that three Reliance Group companies, namely Geo Platforms, Reliance Retail Ventures, and Reliance BP Mobility, together it has received $27.8 billion or 54.1% of the total equity inflows during the 3 quarters. Other large recipients through the far lower shares that were Schneider Electric India, Byju's ArcelorMittal India, GMR Airports, and Amazon Seller Services. So more than $20 billion of promoters share in Geo Platforms, currently having the largest wireless subscriber based in India, that were sold to 14 foreign investors, which included Facebook, Google, KKR and Company, Qualcomm, and a number of financial investors and sovereign wealth funds. So the major part of the funds that was meant to facilitate Reliance Industries to withdraw its investments already made in the form of optionally convertible preference shares. And this has amounted to indirect acquisition of shares that has been held by Reliance Industries. The entire investment in Reliance Retail that was by financial investors, which is viewed in the context of Reliance Group's expansion through acquisitions, for example, Future Group and Urban Platter, the end use of inflows becomes obvious. Again, the bulk of investment into Reliance BP Mobility, that was through the acquisition route. So Facebook's entry in Geo platform that has offered two significant benefits to the foreign partner. One, to substantially expand its social media reach by piggybacking on Geo platforms, and two, giving Facebook a share in India's rapidly expanding commerce business through GeoMart. Following the Facebook deal, Reliance has announced its partnership with Google for building an Android operating system. By selling 7.7% in Geo platforms, Facebook's shareholding was pegged at 9.9%, possibly because the International Monetary Fund and also RBI has stipulated that if a foreign investor holds 10% or more of voting shares in a company, the investors exercises a significant degree of influence on its management. So interestingly, Geo platform remains Indian controlled, and even though two major American companies now they own nearly 18% of their shares. So acquisition lies behind other major inflows as well. Schneider Electric's acquisition and L&T's electrical and automation business, ArcelorMittal's acquisition or Essar Steel, and Byju's acquiring a number of companies, which includes Akash Educational Services. GMR's deal with Group ADP of France paved the way for a foreign government controlled company to have a say in India's aviation infrastructure. And it may be pointed out that RBI's data on acquisition, which is related inflows, grossly underestimate the extent to which foreign investors have taken over existing businesses. So, by alluding to these large cases of inflows, RBI commented in its annual report that even though FDI inflows were stronger in 2021, 2020-21, their distribution was highly skewed, and coefficient of variation of FDI inflows that was based on transaction size was larger during the pandemic period, which implies concentration in redistribution. The lower incidence of transactions, which points to the underlying weaknesses in FDI inflows during the year. Without top five FDI deals, FDI inflows during 2020-21 would have declined by about a third of their level a year ago. And RBI is entirely correct in its observation that without the large inflows mentioned above, there is a serious question mark over FDI inflows. And in the absence of a large inflow, FDI equity inflows suffered a precipitous fall in quarter four of 2020-21, the second lowest inflows in quarter four since 2014-15, that bars 2016-17. So although RBI has expressed its optimism that going forward pipeline of FDI for 2021-22 could be supported by the thrust given to the PLI and domestic growth prospects, the nature of the bulk of the investments, which involved a mere transfer of shares without creating productive assets in the investments, that involves a mere transfer of shares without creating productive assets in the country, perhaps it belies the expectation that FDI can contribute to the revival of the economy. And the view is reinforced by the fact that, contrary to the government's expectations of a larger magnitude of inflows into the manufacturing sector, this sector has received just 17.4% of the total inflows during 2020-21. Now, FDI in service sector. Yeah. So FDI in service sector, what is that? So service sector has attracted nearly 80% of the total inflows, with information technology enabled services that is being the largest component, which accounts for over 47% of inflows. And this is thanks to RBI's classification of geo platforms as other information technology and computer services activities. Wholesale and retail trade were the other prominent ones. As per RBI, non-acquisition related inflows into manufacturing sector, these were the lowest in 2020-21 and even in the absolute terms over the past 5 years. They were $6.7 billion in 2020-21 as compared to $12 billion in 2016-17. And it was lower than even the previous year's amount of $8.2 billion by 1.3%. Quick calculations based on the RBI data, which are gross underestimates, that shows that 34.9% of the reported inflows into the manufacturing sector were acquisition related. And clearly, the FDI inflows have not been in synchronization with the government's priorities for the post-COVID-19 economic recovery. The Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, that anchored on a revival of the manufacturing sector through the performance-linked incentive scheme. And when this is the situation, records levels of FDI inflow during 2020-21 cannot be a cause for celebration. That is all about this article. Moving on to the next. Energy inefficiency that can short circuit cooling India, as Indian homes will be a key site where future cooling demand will play out. Awareness of energy efficiency is crucial. So this is regarding environmental conservation. So more frequent context is that the more frequent and intense heat waves, these are expected with the rise in global temperatures because of climate change. And in the last 3 decades, there have been 660 heat waves across India that has causes more than 12,000 deaths. And India, with currently low penetration levels of air conditioners, that will likely require substantial cooling services to keep citizens healthy and productive. The Indian Cooling Action Plan that projects the number of room air conditioners to become about 4 times in the next 10 years and about 10 times in the next 20 years, that make India the world's largest energy user for cooling. So cooling is going to help at the forefront of India's adaptation to climate change. But if cooling needs are met with inefficient ACs, then it could be the bane for India's mitigation efforts. Indian homes, that will be an important site where this conundrum between cooling needs and potential emissions will play out. And despite its clear importance, the implications of an increase in residential cooling demand that have not been carefully examined. So, estimates of AC ownership and usage, two factors which will determine the extent of future cooling demand that have little empirical backing. And we know very little about what cooling appliances people seek out and how and why people make their purchase decisions. The pursuit of energy efficiency, for instance, who buys efficient technologies and why it remains underexplored. So, in a recently published paper in Environmental Research Letters, some households had cooling patterns and unpacked household characteristics. These are leading to increased use of air conditioners and adoption of energy efficient choices. So, the findings are based on a door to door household survey in areas of Delhi with above average levels of AC penetration. The desired levels of cooling that were found that vary greatly even among relatively homogeneous communities. And in Delhi's wealthy neighborhoods, 43% of the households own an AC, 39% own coolers, and 18% only have a fan. So further, the way households uses ACs are also differs quite a bit. While most households use an AC for 3 to 4 hours a day during peak summer months, and about 15% use ACs over 8 hours a day. So that is interesting to note that India Cooling Action Plan in its estimation of residential cooling demand that assumes that an average household uses an AC for 8 hours a day, that is per hour study seems to be an upper bound. And people prefer different AC set point temperatures. Again, it is indicative of varying perceptions of thermal comfort. Half of the households that set their ACs between 24 degrees Celsius to 26 degrees Celsius, and 27% prefer their AC temperature to be between 21 degrees Celsius to 23 degrees Celsius. So this wide range of preferred AC temperatures that have important implications on energy demand requirements, as every 1 degree Celsius increase in AC had set point temperatures that can lead to additional 6% energy savings. And unfortunately, energy efficiency does not feature as a priority in the purchase of cooling appliances. Only 7% of the households have an energy efficient, that is star rated fan, and 88% of the coolers are locally assembled. These are non-star rated basically. So most people prefer to buy 3-star AC, and less than 20% of the AC owning households bought the highest rated 5-star ACs. So large scale adoption of efficient cooling appliances will be essential to providing the required thermal comfort in a low carbon manner. And it was found that low levels of energy efficiency awareness are a major bottleneck that hinders the purchase of more efficient appliances. And a third of the households that did not know of the star leveling program, which is a government program mandatory for refrigerators and air conditioners. So, of the households that had heard of the program, and only half of them understood what it meant. Set of informed households that were found who were more likely to own a higher efficiency AC and also unlikely to use the appliance efficiently. Higher upfront cost and low market availability of more efficient air conditioners, which is 4-star and 5-star. These are other reasons of buying a less efficient AC. And it was found that many households also use alternative cooling strategies to keep cool, with the use of a fan being the favorite non-AC cooling option, and use of non-energy cooling methods like natural ventilation being a common practice. Households that use such non-AC cooling methods, these are found to use their AC for fewer hours. So awareness campaigns are required for this. Impending cooling demand transition in India that offers a potential advantage because a majority of investments in cooling technologies like infrastructure, behaviors are yet to be made. And there is a unique opportunity to lock in energy efficient consumption patterns. Awareness campaigns on the benefits of energy efficiency, along with the subsidies and financial incentives that help with the higher upfront cost, can help drive up the adoption of more efficient technologies. Encouraging the use of passive cooling alternatives that include energy efficient building designs that can also provide help the desired thermal comfort with reduced dependence on energy intensive cooling technologies. So here awareness campaigning are required, what should be used and how effectively it should be used. So star rating, high star rating is required, and for this people need some studies, people need some information on this. Now, next article of the day, that is about in India looking beyond the binary to a spectrum. A delay in the provision of marriage rights to same-sex couples which foul of constitutional guarantees judgments. So context this is about the rights or right to marriage of LGBTQIA community, QIA plus community. So context is that recently when cases surrounding the questions of same-sex marriages that came up before High Court of Delhi, Union government has found to be a deterrent, and Solicitor General of India, he made himself available only to request the court to have the matter that adjourned on the ground that it was not urgent. And Union government argued that the matter was not important in the context of second wave of COVID-19 cases. So this is not important to take up. So it overlooked the basic notion that plight of persons in the same sex and queer relationships looking after each other without the legal protection of marital relationships was exacerbated by the pandemic. And in any case, it is a matter of some concern that Union government does not find urgency in a matter of extending civil rights to a class of person who have approached a constitutional court. So nevertheless, given the march of law, both international and domestic, in the direction of expanding human rights, jurisprudence necessarily means that provision of marriage rights to the same sex and queer couples is only a matter of time. And any further delay in doing so would fall foul of our constitutional guarantees that judgments rendered by various high courts and evolving international jurisprudence. The last 2 decades have witnessed tremendous progress in establishing civil rights for the LGBTQIA plus community, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and others. Okay, that is the full form of LGBTQIA plus community. So in 2005, the Constitutional Court of South Africa got the case of Minister of Home Affairs and other versus Fori and another. Lesbian and Gay Equality Project and 18 others versus Ministry of Home Affairs and others, ZACC 19. That was the case. So unanimously it held that the common law definition of marriage, what is that? That was a union of one man with one woman. That was inconsistent with the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa as per 1996. Consequently, Parliament of South Africa had given 12 months to amend the Marriage Act 25 of 1961. That failing which the Marriage Act would stand amended by virtue of the decision of Constitutional Court to include the words or spouse after words or husband. So wherever husband was there, it was amended and written as spouse. So anybody could be there. So as a result of the verdict, Civil Union Act 2006 was enacted that enabled the voluntary union of two persons above 18 years of age by way of marriage. And in 2007 in Australia, reforms to civil rights to queer community were prompted by the Honorable Michael Kirby, then Judge of High Court of Australia, and writing to Attorney General of Australia by asking for the judicial pension scheme to be extended to his gay partner of 38 years old by that time. So after initial opposition from the federal government, so he was a government person and he asked for judicial pension scheme for his gay partner from the Attorney General. So the person, he himself was Honorable Judge of High Court of Australia. So after initial opposition from the federal government, same-sex relationship, that is equal treatment in Commonwealth laws, General Law Reform Act 2008 that came to be enacted to provide equal entitlements for same-sex couples in matters of social security, employment, and taxation. Give me a second. Similarly, in England and Wales, The Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act 2019 has been enabled same-sex couples to marry in civil ceremonies or with religious rites. So it has been allowed in UK too, or England too. So more recently, 2015, Supreme Court of United States had decided that the fundamental rights to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. And the case of Obergefell versus Hodge ushered in a landmark shift in the American position, and it has allowed same-sex marriages to be recognized and treated on a par with opposite-sex marriages. And while doing so, Supreme Court of United States held the denial of marriage rights to the same-sex couples to be a grave and continuing harm that serving to disrespect and subordinate gays and lesbians. So across the world, the recognition of the unequal laws that discriminating against the LGBTQIA plus community has acted as a trigger to reform and modernize legal architecture to become more inclusive and equal. So these were the instances of world. Now what about India? So solemnizing marriages in India. What is that? What is the instance? So in India, marriages solemnized under personal laws like Hindu Marriage Act 1955, Indian Christian Marriage Act 1872, Muslim Personal Law Shariat Application Act 1937, and so on. For different religion, different marriage acts are there in India. Presently, though same-sex and queer marriages, these are not clearly recognized in India, and we are not bereft of judicial guidance. In case of Arun Kumar and Shrija versus the Inspector General of Registration and others, the Madurai bench of High Court of Madras has employed a beneficial and purposive interpretation that holding that the term bride under the Hindu Marriage Act 1955 that includes trans women and intersex persons identified as a women, and therefore marriage solemnized between a male and a trans woman, both professing the Hindu religion, is deemed to be a valid marriage under the Act. This has been said by Madurai bench. So the import of this judgment cannot be overstated as it expands the scope of a term used in the Hindu Marriage Act 1955 in a progressive manner, that a male and a trans woman can marry and it is valid under Hindu Marriage Act. So it was the interpretation of the Hindu Marriage Act in a progressive way, and it sets the stage for reimagining marriages rights of LGBTQIA plus community. So the judgment of Madras High Court that builds on the tenets that laid down by the Supreme Court of India in Shafeen Jahan versus Ashokan KM and others, wherein the right to choose and marry a partner was considered to be a constitutionally guaranteed freedom. And by doing so, Supreme Court has held that the intimacies of marriage lie within a core zone of privacy, which is inviolable, and that society has no role to play in determining our choices of partners. So the only logical interpretation from reading these cases together that is apparently that any legal or statutory bar to same-sex or queer marriages must necessarily be held to be unconstitutional, and specifically it is violative of Article 14, 15 and 21 of the Constitution of India. So no longer can the position of the union government that marriage is a bond between a biological man and a biological woman be tenable. So expansion of the scope of marriage. The domain of marriages, which including religious marriages, cannot be immune to reform and review. Self-respect marriages that legalized in Tamil Nadu and subsequently in Puducherry through amendments to the Hindu Marriage Act 1955. So self-respect marriages that commonly conducted among those who are part of the Dravidian movement, and they have done away with priest and religious symbols like fire or saptapadi. So instead, solemnization of self-respect marriages only requires an exchange of rings and or garlands or tying of Mangal Sutra. That is it. Such reforms of Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 bring self-respect marriages under its very umbrella. And it's seen as a strong move towards breaking caste-based practices within the institution of marriage. Similarly, understanding the needs of LGBTQIA plus community today, the law must now expand the institution of marriage to include all gender and sexual identities. And at least 29 countries in the world have legalized same-sex marriage. So this is the time that India thinks beyond the binary and reviews its existing legal architecture in order to legalize marriages irrespective of gender identity and sexual orientation. So it means, as per the constitution, marriage rights should be expanded to these people as well. So these are the articles what has been published in the newspaper in the past 1 week, and these were important for different papers. I hope it is helpful for you. So so this is it for the day. I hope it is helpful. So thank you so much. Have a nice day. This is Preeti Sagar signing off. Bye bye. Take care.